The moment a Spartan mother gave birth to a son, she knew his fate was sealed. This wasn't a child who would grow up playing games, learning trades, or helping with family business. This was a future weapon, and the state would claim him before he could even form proper memories of home. And you thought your parents were strict about screen time. Every other civilization in ancient Greece treated childhood as a precious time for growth and learning. But Sparta turned childhood into a battlefield where only the strongest survived. The Agoge was a systematic psychological and physical torture designed to break down everything human in a boy and rebuild him as a killing machine. The word Agoge itself means to raise or to lead, but what it really meant was to drag children through hell until they emerged as something else entirely. The Agoge was the ancient Spartan education program, which trained male youths in the art of war. Most people think they understand what this means, but buddy, the reality was far more horrifying than anything most modern minds can grasp. At age 7, when boys in other Greek cities were starting to learn their letters and help their fathers with simple tasks, Spartan children faced their first test of survival. State officials would arrive at family homes without warning and examine each boy like livestock being evaluated for market. They checked for physical defects, signs of weakness, and anything that might suggest the child couldn't handle what was coming. The inspection was brutal and impersonal. Boys who showed any sign of illness, deformity, or frailty were rejected immediately. But acceptance was a death sentence delivered slowly over the next 13 years. Congratulations, kid, you passed. Your prize? 13 years of absolute hell. It was mandatory for boys in Spartan society, who were descendants of Spartan citizens, to enter the Agoge at age 7. The only exceptions were the sons of kings, who were considered too valuable to risk losing to the system that killed so many others. Once selected, boys were torn from their families and thrown into stone barracks that housed dozens of children, in conditions that would horrify modern child welfare workers. There was no adjustment period, no gentle introduction to military life. From the first night, they were expected to adapt or die. The barracks themselves were designed to break spirits. Cold stone walls, no privacy, no comfort, and the constant presence of older boys who had survived long enough to become tormentors themselves. New arrivals learned quickly that crying would be punished, homesickness was a luxury they couldn't afford, and the only way to survive was to become as hard as the stones they slept on. But the physical conditions were only the beginning of their nightmare. Food in the Agoge was a psychological warfare. The centerpiece of Spartan military meals was something called black broth, a mixture so disgusting that foreign visitors would literally vomit after tasting it. The recipe included pig's blood, vinegar, and salt, boiled together into what ancient sources described as a liquid that looked like it came from hell itself. This makes cafeteria food look like a 5-star restaurant. Boys had to be grateful for this slop. Showing disgust while eating would result in punishment, and complaining about food was strictly forbidden. They learned to consume anything put in front of them without expression, no matter how revolting it tasted or smelled. This destroyed their sense of individual preferences and replaced it with a military obedience. The portions were deliberately insufficient to keep the boys hungry as part of their conditioning. They were expected to supplement their meager rations through theft and foraging. But if they got caught stealing, the punishment was for being incompetent enough to get caught. Successful theft was actually encouraged as a military skill. Yeah, you heard that right. This was literally the only school where getting caught cheating meant you weren't cheating hard enough. This created a twisted survival game where boys had to become criminals to avoid starvation, but skilled criminals to avoid punishment. They learned to lie, cheat, and steal as essential life skills, while simultaneously developing the discipline to follow orders without question. The contradiction was intentional, which taught them that morality was whatever served Spartan interests. If you're still here, go ahead and subscribe for more wild history. Because what comes next makes the starvation look like mercy. The physical training in Spartan barracks was controlled violence designed to eliminate anyone who couldn't handle actual warfare. The boys were specifically trained in boxing, wrestling, javelin throwing, discus throwing, and, surprisingly enough, dancing. But this was systematic brutalization. Boys were beaten regularly, not as punishment for wrongdoing, but as conditioning for combat. They learned to take hits without crying, to fight back when attacked, and to keep going even when their bodies wanted to quit. The instructors were breaking down natural human responses to pain and replacing them with military reflexes. Boys in training underwent extremely harsh and brutal physical conditioning. This had a sole aim: to hone strong warrior physiques that could endure the worst conditions during a real-life battle. Combat training started with wooden weapons and progressed to real bronze spears and swords, as the boys proved they could handle them without accidentally killing each other too often. Injuries were common and expected. Deaths were not unusual and barely mourned. Medical care was minimal because the Agoge philosophy demanded that boys learn to function despite injuries. A warrior who couldn't fight with broken bones or bleeding wounds was useless to Sparta. So boys who couldn't recover from training injuries quickly were often dismissed from the program entirely. At age 12, the physical conditioning became even more extreme. Boys were stripped of all clothing except a single red cloak, and forced to sleep outside year-round. This permanent exposure to the elements was designed to condition their bodies to function in any environment without shelter or protection. The red cloak served a practical purpose beyond identification, and it disguised bloodstains during training and combat. Boys learned early that they would be bleeding regularly, and their clothing was designed to hide the evidence. The color became a symbol of their transformation from individual children into components of the Spartan war machine. Life in the barracks operated on a brutal hierarchy, where age meant power, and power meant survival. The oldest boys had absolute authority over the younger ones, and they used this authority to create their own kingdom of terror within the military system. Many boys would end up dying during the brutal training. Those who survived became true Spartan soldiers and were unbeaten in battle. This was like high school bullying, except the bullies could literally kill you, and nobody would bat an eye. Older boys could demand food, clothing, or services from younger ones, and refusal meant violence. Boys who showed exceptional skills could rise in the social order regardless of age, while those who showed weakness would find themselves at the bottom no matter how long they'd been in the system. The instructors encouraged this internal competition because it mimicked the realities of military command. Future Spartan officers needed to learn how to command respect, maintain discipline, and make life or death decisions about the men under their command. The barracks hierarchy was training for the chain of command they would use in actual warfare. Those who couldn't adapt to the hierarchy often didn't survive. Boys who were consistently victimized would sometimes die from their injuries, commit suicide, or simply waste away from the psychological stress. The system depended on it to eliminate the weak, which is about as heartwarming as it sounds. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of Agoge training was the systematic destruction of individual personality. The goal was to eliminate every trace of independent thought and replace it with absolute loyalty to the state. Boys were forbidden from maintaining relationships with their parents, siblings, or anyone outside the barracks system. Contact with family was strictly limited and carefully supervised. The message was clear. Your only family now is your military brothers, and your only purpose is serving Spartan interests. This isolation extended to every aspect of human connection. Boys were encouraged to form intense emotional bonds with their military partners, but these relationships were carefully managed to reinforce rather than compete with military loyalty. Love and affection were redirected away from family and toward the military unit. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and complete. Boys learned that individual desires, personal preferences, and independent thinking were not just discouraged, but actively dangerous. The only safe thoughts were military thoughts. The only acceptable emotions were military emotions. And the only valid identity was that of a Spartan soldier. This emotional reconstruction created warriors who were literally incapable of normal civilian life. They had been conditioned to find meaning only in military service, satisfaction only in violence, and identity only in their role as Spartan soldiers. The most horrifying aspect of barracks life was reserved for the elite few who showed exceptional promise during their training. The Crypteia was an ancient Spartan institution in which the ablest and most intelligent young men were extracted from their training unit within the Agoge and transformed into something even more dangerous than regular warriors. Those Hibontes, who had impressed their elders the most during their training, could be selected for the Crypteia, a type of secret police tasked with maintaining control over the Helot population through violence. This was creating state-sanctioned killers. Every autumn, the Spartan government would formally declare war on their Helot slaves, giving members of the Crypteia legal permission to murder them without consequences. Every autumn, according to Plutarch, young men selected for this program were given a simple mission: hunt humans like animals and prove they could kill without hesitation or remorse. To train them for warfare, they would be given daggers and a few essential supplies, then ordered to murder helots at will. They would sneak along roads and into fields, often in the countryside and often at night, and pounce on unsuspecting helots. The psychological impact on the boys who participated was enormous and intentional. The Crypteia operatives would be sent out with minimal supplies, forced to live off the land and whatever they could steal or take by force. They moved through Helot communities at night, identifying potential troublemakers, gathering intelligence, and occasionally murdering slaves who showed signs of leadership or rebellion. This was literally creating sociopaths with military training and a government license to kill. Boys learned that human life had no value outside of Spartan citizenship, that violence was not just acceptable but praiseworthy when it served state interests, and that they were above any moral law that might restrain ordinary people. The entire Agoge system was built on a foundation that most people don't understand about Sparta. It was essentially a military occupation force ruling over a massive enslaved population. The Helots were conquered peoples who had been enslaved by Sparta and forced to work the land. These slaves outnumbered Spartan citizens by at least 7 to 1, creating a constant threat of rebellion. Spartiate males underwent the Agoge, an education and training program designed to produce elite warriors. The dominant Spartan caste, known as Spartiates, held political power, while Helots, a subjugated population, performed agricultural labor and supported the economy. This demographic reality shaped everything about barracks life. The boys were being trained to suppress domestic uprisings, control a hostile population, and maintain a system of oppression that depended entirely on fear and violence. The brutality of their training reflected the brutality required to keep their society functioning. Unlike traditional slaves, Helots were allowed to accumulate some wealth and maintain family structures, which made them even more dangerous to Spartan control. Wealthy, organized Helots with family ties were exactly the kind of people who might organize rebellions. The barrack system produced warriors specifically designed to identify and eliminate these threats. Boys learned to view Helots not as human beings, but as dangerous animals that required constant management. They were taught that showing mercy to Helots was showing weakness to enemies, and that any Helot who displayed intelligence, leadership, or prosperity was automatically a threat to Spartan security. The Spartan public education system, the Agoge, trained the mind as well as the body. Spartans were not only literate but also admired for their intellectual culture and poetry. But this intellectual training was about creating warriors who were as dangerous with information as they were with weapons. Boys learned sophisticated intelligence gathering techniques that could destabilize entire cities. The intelligence training started with observation exercises where boys would be required to memorize complex details about people, places, and activities, then report their findings with perfect accuracy. Mistakes in observation led to severe punishment because intelligence failures in real operations could mean the death of entire military units. They learned to adopt disguises, speak different dialects, and blend into foreign populations. Some boys became so skilled at infiltration that they could pass as natives in enemy cities, gathering intelligence for months or years before revealing their true identities. The most successful graduates could function as spies, assassins, and saboteurs who could bring down governments from within. They learned that information could be more powerful than armies, that fear could be more effective than force, and that the right lie told at the right time could accomplish what thousands of soldiers couldn't. Despite the brutality, or perhaps because of it, boys who survived the Agoge system formed bonds that were stronger than family connections. They had shared experiences that no one else could understand, survived horrors that would break most people, and depended on each other for survival in ways that created unbreakable loyalty. But the real result, during their time in the Agoge, the boys lived in shared barracks and followed a strict routine that included limited meals and constant exercises. The aim was to train their bodies as weapons and to teach them the Spartan qualities of stamina, toughness, and independence. But the real result was creating warriors who would die before betraying each other. These bonds became the foundation of Spartan military effectiveness. When Spartan warriors fought together, they were protecting the brothers who had suffered alongside them, who had shared their food when they were starving, who had covered for them when they were caught stealing, who had helped them survive when survival seemed impossible. The brotherhood extended beyond friendship into absolute trust. Spartan warriors knew that the man fighting beside them had already proven his courage, endurance, and loyalty under the worst possible conditions. There was no question about whether he would hold the line, follow orders, or sacrifice himself for the group. This trust created a military unit that fought with unprecedented coordination and fearlessness. Other armies were collections of individual soldiers trying to stay alive. Spartan armies were unified organisms where each warrior was willing to die rather than let down his brothers. The Agoge worked exactly as designed, but the price was enormous in human terms. Finished with the Agoge at age 20, the young Spartan had to be selected by a group of older peers before he became a full Spartan citizen. But most boys who entered the system never reached that point. And when I say never reached that point, I mean they were dead. Modern historians estimate that the majority of boys who entered the Agoge never emerged as full Spartan citizens. Some died from the physical rigors of training. Others were killed during combat exercises or the criminal activities they were forced to undertake. Many more were dismissed from the program for failing to meet impossible standards. Those failures weren't sent home to their families. They became second-class citizens called perioeci, with no political rights and limited economic opportunities. They lived as permanent reminders of what happened to those who couldn't measure up to Spartan standards. The boys who did survive were often psychologically destroyed in ways that affected every aspect of their lives. They struggled with relationships, couldn't adapt to peacetime activities, and frequently died young from the cumulative effects of childhood trauma and physical abuse. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts of systematic brutalization. Adult Spartan males had bone density and muscle attachment points that exceeded anything seen in other Greek populations, but they also showed signs of repeated trauma, nutritional stress during growth periods, and chronic injuries that suggested lives of constant physical punishment. Perhaps most disturbing was how the system perpetuated itself. The men who survived the Agoge became the instructors for the next generation, passing on the trauma, brutality, and psychological damage to new groups of children. Each generation tried to match or exceed their own horrific experiences, creating an escalating cycle of abuse. Known as the Agoge, Spartan military education produced the finest hoplites in the Greek world for generations, capable of fighting in rank and file in the phalanx in a manner that both awed and struck fear in their contemporaries. But this military excellence came at the cost of creating a society that could only function through systematic child abuse. The instructors were damaged products of the same system, men who had been so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that they genuinely believed the torture they inflicted was necessary and beneficial. They passed on their trauma as if it were wisdom, their psychological damage as if it were strength. This created a feedback loop where each generation became more extreme than the last. The system demanded constant escalation because anything less than what the previous generation had endured was considered weakness. Boys had to suffer more than their instructors had suffered to prove they were worthy of the Spartan name. The Agoge system worked exactly as designed for over 3 centuries, creating the most feared military force in ancient Greece and producing warriors whose reputation for courage and effectiveness became legendary throughout the ancient world. But the ultimate irony is that the system which made Sparta dominant also guaranteed its eventual decline. The boys who survived those hellish barracks became men who could only function in the specific type of warfare for which they had been trained. When military tactics evolved beyond the phalanx formation, when economic competition became more important than military conquest, Sparta found itself with a military force that was perfectly adapted to a world that no longer existed. The Agoge produced warriors who were too specialized for their own good. They were perfectly designed killing machines who couldn't adapt to changing circumstances, couldn't innovate beyond their training, and couldn't function in the peaceful, economically complex world that was emerging around them. Sparta never developed the arts, philosophy, or economic innovations that other Greek cities used to build lasting civilizations. The constant focus on military excellence came at the expense of everything else that made societies sustainable and adaptable. The Agoge revealed something disturbing about human nature: that societies can normalize any level of cruelty if they can convince themselves it serves a greater purpose. The Spartans saw themselves as the creators of perfection, the guardians of excellence, the defenders of civilization itself. They were basically running a child abuse factory and calling it education. The boys who survived this system became living monuments to what human beings can endure and what they can become when everything soft and individual is burned away. They were proof that people can be transformed into almost anything if the pressure is applied correctly and relentlessly enough. The Agoge succeeded in creating the perfect warriors for its time and place, but it failed to create human beings who could build anything lasting beyond warfare itself. The boys who entered those barracks as children emerged as something that was both more and less than human, something that could conquer armies but couldn't conquer the future.